Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the podcast, my guest is Tim Picciot. Tim is a fellow certified financial planner and has been operating inside the cryptocurrency space for some time. I want to say more than 10 years at this point. So he is exceptionally knowledgeable in this space and joined me today to talk everything crypto. We go over what it is, some of the nuances of the different coins, where he sees things going, some of the geopolitical implications. He is a wealth of knowledge in this space, and we had an excellent conversation about the state of the crypto market and where things could go from here. Just to give you a quick heads up, Tim's views are somewhat on the maybe extreme side of the spectrum. I don't share all of them with him, but he is very knowledgeable about how Fed policy works and how cryptocurrencies work, and was a pleasure to have on as a guest because I learned a whole heck of a lot from the discussion, and I hope that you do too. In the future, I hope that we will have some guests on who are maybe on the other end of the spectrum and not quite so bullish on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, just for context. But this was a wonderful place to start, and I look forward to having Tim on sometime in the future as well. Hey, everybody. Real quick before we jump into today's episode, I have been advised by my attorneys to remind you all that none of what you might hear in today or any other episode of Grow Money Business is financial, investing, tax, legal, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and deploy on your own terms. And before you take any actions on what we might cover in the show, I really encourage you to consult with your accountant, attorney, or financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner and think that you might need one, be sure to check out threeoakswealth.com to learn more about my firm's planning, advice, and investment services. Tim Picciot, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is take two. We just had a little bit of minor technical difficulties. Tim, I'm glad we weren't like 30 or 40 minutes into the episode before realizing that something went awry. We're about 30 seconds in and Tim's mic cut out. So Tim, I appreciate you being on today. You have a very interesting background. This is a show about helping business owners align what's going on with their business, with their personal lives and their personal finances. Cryptocurrency is something that's somewhat pervasive in the financial media these days. It's something that we get a whole lot of questions about. It's something I know a little bit about. I would not consider myself an expert. You're also a practicing CFP and have a lot of really interesting background in this stuff. So I'm really happy to have you on to share some of this wisdom that you have in the cryptocurrency space. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you what your career looks like, how you got into this, where that background lies?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure to start my career September 15th, 2008. And for those of you who don't know, that's actually the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. So, welcome to the business. I was in a class where my classmates won the national competition on the Federal Reserve back in 2008. And, I thought I knew everything at the time. And then immediately get into the workforce and everything, collapses, and, very difficult career path when you don't have rich parents and you're 22 years old and day one, the market, goes to crap. So, welcome to the business. Every other person I came into the business with, there's 3 other people, and they all, I think failed out pretty much immediately. So, it is definitely like a very high stress thing when you're starting off. But, getting into that world, of seeing how everything, collapsed and really trying to reverse engineer what went on, it got me to understand central banking more. And then one day I had a chance conversation with this guy that looked like Rob Zombie, and he, had his hair, way down, and he starts telling me that the Fed Reserve is private. And I actually didn't believe him and thought he was full of crap and told him that, and then decided to prove him wrong, and then basically found out that I was wrong. And so, a lot of the stuff that I say that sounds crazy, just realized that I thought it sounded crazy. And then I went to go research that and found out the Federal Reserve actually isn't, part of the government. I mean, it sort of quasi is, but it is, owned by private central bankers. And it basically got me to understand that the modern central banking at a high level is a absolute scam where we have to borrow our money into existence. And pretty much our money is basically privately owned when you really break it down at a very high level. So if you take a look at your dollar, it says Federal Reserve note, And in essence, like if we were on an island, and let's say we're the only two people on an island, and you want to borrow money from me, and I'm the banker, I would just print up money out of thin air and say, hey, here, Grant, here's $100, 3% interest. You want to start your financial advising career? Wouldn't be a great career because I'd be the only person on the island. I'm a banker, but if you wanted to start your own financial advising career, you want to borrow $100 from me, 1 year loan, 3% interest. Well, at the end of year one, you'd owe me $103, but the island only created $100. So how do you get another $3? You've got to borrow more money into the existence. And so at the root fundamental basis, I realized that the current system we have is pretty much, without mincing words, it's sort of like high-tech slavery, or sort of, is a scam. And that, led me down like the road of, Dr. Ron Paul and some other, but a lot of people found out about the Fed from him, and I found out about the Fed, then found out about him from there. And that led me into like the libertarian, anarchist type circles and world. And that's how I discovered Bitcoin. But I didn't really think, when I knew about it at $1, that it was going to, break out to exactly where it is today. I thought it was obviously this fringe thing that was going to stay there. And, being a struggling advisor, I didn't get in at the time because it was very early to try to get in. It was very hard to get in early. I mean, it wasn't like today where you just go, search engine it and go, find, go on Coinbase or one of the other major exchanges. Like those didn't exist back in the day. And it was a very convoluted process. So it was understanding about the Federal Reserve and then getting, deep into the libertarian circles. That is how I discovered it. And it wasn't until, 2017 when I started getting into it personally, and early 2017. And then by mid 2017, I had a guy that was, somewhat influential in the crypto circles, invite me to, one of his parties. And then all of a sudden, and this is Bitcoin's like $3,000 at the time, just for like a timestamp on this, like August 2017. He's like, hey, we got a bunch of rich crypto people here. How would they get into, how would they, let's say, cash out some of their Bitcoin to buy, let's say you put in $1,000, now I've got 10 million. How would you cash some out without getting killed on taxes? And so, long story short, I figured out some of those strategies involving charitable remainder trusts and different types of donor advised funds and other things that they could do to help lower their tax burdens. And then along with that, people started asking me about, crypto IRAs and self-directed IRAs. And that was something that we were doing, and where people could have their private keys into crypto. But we did stop doing that because now the IRS seems like they've frowned upon that. And we have other ways to get exposure to Bitcoin in IRAs, where essentially there are custodians that we work with where they can custody actual crypto within their accounts. Now that, you're somewhat limited right now in terms of like, some of the major ones out there. So you can't get, like number 2000 coin that's out there, or even, even something like outside of the top 50 really. But, and personally, once you get outside of Bitcoin's really the only one that I think that I feel safe enough or confident enough, locking away in a drawer and coming back in 20 years and thinking it's still going to be there, whereas the other ones are more or less hot potatoes. So that probably answered your question in terms of like how I got into the space. It was really sort of, just happenstance that I, graduated during 2008 when everything had collapsed, and led me to different libertarian circles and understanding how the world worked. And then basically understood that everything that I thought I knew about the world was completely upside down. And then that got me looking into lots of other areas. But, it was more or less wanting to opt out of the current system as much as I could as a hedge against what, central banks are doing. And, what central banks were doing then versus what they're doing now, they're even crazier now than they were before. And I thought they were pretty crazy before. So.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that did answer my question. And you came in hot with some Federal Reserve takes there. What was the term you used? Financial slavery?
High-tech slavery. I mean, because honestly, like the best slave is someone that doesn't know they are a slave. So, if you're walking around, doing your daily thing, but then you've got to pay this extortion tax because they get to print money out of thin air and then buy up real assets. So they never had the money to begin with. They print it up, and then now they're buying, I think it's like $105 billion of mortgages a month. I think the Fed's meeting today. So by the time this is released, maybe it will be a different number by the time people are hearing this. But it's still a lot. I mean, they go from throwing like an extreme amount of gasoline on a fire to like a ton of gasoline on the fire that they're still throwing on right now. So I think it's really irresponsible. And eventually, I think that it's the whole system is probably going to collapse underneath a hyper debt bubble. I mean, we're both young guys, so I think on a long enough time horizon, I can definitely see that happening, certainly in our lifetimes. And I know it sounds crazy, but it sounded a lot crazier when I was saying that 10 years ago versus now, where nothing seems crazy anymore. So the bar of craziness after the pandemic has been certainly raised.
Yeah, and there are probably some people listening to this thinking, well, wait a second, the Federal Reserve creates money on a thin air, and yeah, that's what they do. This is the way that fiat currencies work, and this is the way they've always worked since the first one. And I don't know do you know what the first fiat currency was?
I'm not sure if I know what the first one was, but I mean, every fiat currency has gone back to its intrinsic value of zero eventually on a long enough time horizon. I mean, if you go back to the early 1900s, the British pound was I think like 60% of world uh, you know global trade, and before that, I think Portugal, like their dollar was the world reserve currency, and so eventually the world reserve currency will no longer be the dollar. And it's really, if you think about it, not fair to the other 95% of the world population that isn't in America, where a lot of our inflation is exported to them. And like if you're the Chinese, for instance, like, yeah, they make a lot of crap and we're buying their crap, but we give them IOUs and we're getting real stuff. So I mean, if I think that the people getting the IOUs are sort of on the short end of the stick of that. And so if you're the rest of the world, just putting on like a pragmatic hat here, I mean, the rest of the world is sort of getting screwed by this arrangement. And so they do talk about it, and they do write books on this stuff. And they've been talking about this since the 70s. The dollar having reserve status is an exorbitant privilege, and it's a privilege where basically the central bankers have been abusing that privilege in America for certainly if you go back to Janet Yellen, and today with Powell, and I like to call him Osama Ben Bernanke. I mean, they've all these guys have just been completely reckless and not acting like they've wanted to actually hold on to that reserve status. And there are some bigger names now that actually sound like me. So I mean, like Jeffrey Gundlach now sort of sounds like me now, talking about how the dollar's on its way to losing reserve status at some point. Like Ray Dalio sort of now even sounds like me. And so these are like some of the biggest bond fund managers and hedge fund managers in the world too. So it's not just little old me now saying this stuff, which is sort of crazy.
Yeah, personally, I don't know that I share such an extreme point of view on all of it, but I agree with quite a bit of what you're saying. And this is what they talk about when people throw around the term late stage capitalism. You have generations that are coming into a fair amount of economic wealth as a country that didn't necessarily earn it. And the tides really turned for the United States in World War II. You have this generation where a whole bunch of young men got sent off to war. A lot of them died, and the U.S. basically earned the spoils of after winning that war. We had all the gold, we had all the world power. All of a sudden, because of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and now we're a couple generations removed from that, and we have this. I don't know, would you call it maybe entitlement, where we think we're able to spend more than we earn as a country, and we have systems in place in our government where we just kind of continue doing that and feel like we're entitled to do this. We spend a lot more than we take in from tax revenues every single year, and that snowballs over time, and you can't keep taking on more and more debt indefinitely. The dam has to break at some point. That's the cycle of capitalism. You mentioned the British pound in Portugal. It was the Netherlands before that, if I recall. And you mentioned Ray Dalio. He wrote a really good book on this. It just came out, The Changing World Order, I want to say. But it's a consistent cycle. I don't want to get too far down the path of Fed policy, if that's okay, and circle back to crypto. Give us a 30,000-foot view of how you would define Bitcoin and how you would define the blockchain.
Well, blockchain is the underlying technology behind Bitcoin. And so there are a lot of applications where blockchain is going to be used to basically make the world run a lot more efficiently. So, I mean, you could, in essence, have the stock market trading on a blockchain where, instead of owning the S&P 500, index fund, you could actually own all 500 stocks in there, and through the blockchain, that could be done, efficiently and not costing like $6-7 a trade. And then getting back to Bitcoin, it was the first blockchain-based technology, and in essence, it's a gigantic computer network, the largest, strongest, most powerful computing network in the world. And that computing network is, in essence, your people are doing work on that network in order to secure the network. And in essence, the underlying technology, Bitcoin has sort of now morphed into a digital gold store of value, where, and the high level version for someone that doesn't really want to geek out in this is basically, you'd have to have, just an astronomical amount of power to try to overtake this network. And Bitcoin can't really be hacked. It can be attacked, but in order to attack it, you'd have to have such massive amount of energy that it really wouldn't be feasible. And so it's just a way to secure value where you've got an actual free market that's working out there, as opposed to central banks that are dictating or decreeing what the interest rates should be. I mean, not to get down the Fed policy rabbit hole, but they just announced the other day that the inflation rate, the admitted one, is 6.8%, and the Fed funds rate is 0. So, and then, a 10-year treasury bond is what, like 1.4 something, 1.5. So, you're basically guaranteed to lose over 5% a year if you own a 10-year treasury. And so I'm putting more faith in basically the free market of Bitcoin than I am the, controlled market of, US treasury bond or any treasury bond type system in the world. But, it is a hard thing to define, exactly what Bitcoin is, because, there could be, like the 10-hour version answer of it. And the thing is, people just need to do their homework, need to do their research. And, most people that would have criticism of Bitcoin, I can guarantee you, maybe aside from like Peter Schiff, but most people would probably have, you would need to have like 100 hours at least into looking into this before you should make like an opinion of what you think about Bitcoin. And I just think there aren't enough people out there, some people that have negative opinions on it, they just have not done enough research. And there's also a lot of con men, a lot of hype men, and a lot of, people who are just looking for the next Bitcoin to, go up 1,000,000% and, be rich. And so you see a lot of people who are in it for the money, and a lot of people that are in it for the money are probably going to lose a lot of their money because they're, going into these fly by night type, coins and operations just to try to make a quick buck. But that wasn't what, drove me to that. And, honestly, it really shouldn't be what drives other people. It shouldn't necessarily be the money into this. But, but Bitcoin can do a lot of things. And the underlying blockchain technology at some point will probably run the internet. You'll have different situations where, throughout history, this is the first time where we have the ability to have an immutable record of information where, let's say, you could have the Bible that is on the blockchain. Then if somebody at a later date tried changing what's in the Bible, you would know, okay, it's been changed at this date. This is what it used to say. This is what it says now. And so obviously, there's, people are pretty leery these days of the media, rightfully. And just imagine, and we're in a society where everyone has all the information that they could possibly gather in their, in their pocket with their phone, and all the lying and manipulation that goes on today. And just imagine when, almost no one could read or write and no one had to access information, how, things were probably changed throughout history to benefit, the victors. And this is really the first time where we have history that could be immutable, where, if it does get changed in the record, then we would know like what it used to say before. And that is incredibly valuable, incredibly powerful. And, I think one aspect of this that people overlook, and, personally, I did, I've had bouts of, getting kicked off YouTube channels and things like that, where, because the powers that be don't necessarily like what you're saying. Especially if you're talking about the Fed and some of the stuff that I talk about. So in essence, I realized that with blockchain technology, instead of having to go to, let's say, the Amazon cloud or the Microsoft cloud or the Google cloud, or, one of these other platforms that could just basically kick you off, you could have a decentralized platform, like using something like Ethereum, for instance, which is another blockchain based technology. And then you could use the distributed power of the entire network running the back end of your, let's say, website or application or project. Now, we're still in the infancy. We're in the absolute infancy of that, but it's just, to me, very powerful when you have, where you can do that from a decentralized aspect as opposed to going to one of these big centralized, big tech companies, which I've, already just mentioned. And, if they don't like what you're saying, they can just kick you off, or if the government, goes to them and says, hey, this person's going against the grain of what we want, we can just kick you off. And to me, um, building on any platform that can just kick you off is sort of just a waste of time, because I've seen it happen to me on Facebook and on YouTube and other places. And I just don't want to waste my time on these platforms that can, essentially control you and kick you off. And so to me, it can be an incredibly freeing thing, but, just sort of like a gun can be used to, for good or for bad. Blockchain could be used for good or for bad. And, we could probably get into like central bank digital currencies, or, these stable coins, where things are going from there. I mean, that's a whole like episode on itself, talking about, some of those rabbit holes. But, it is a very, I think we still are in the infancy of where things are going with this. And so I'm not sure if you wanted to maybe transition into like maybe talk about some of the different coins. I did mention Ethereum and how that was, a little bit different than Bitcoin, because they sort of are trying to do different things, where Bitcoin is this massive computer network that is storing your wealth through electricity, whereas Ethereum is basically trying to be, I sort of liken it as like the iOS, or, Google Play Store, where you can build applications on top of this network to do other things. Whereas Bitcoin right now, it isn't really, because of the scaling, it isn't really primed to do that. And basically the biggest thing the developers and Bitcoin are worried about is to not mess up Bitcoin. And we could argue if it's been messed up or not. It's a whole nother inside baseball type show. But it was once I discovered what Ethereum was in late 2016, when I was like, holy crap, there's more that you can do with this than just send fake money back and forth. Because when I first heard about Bitcoin at $1, all I knew about was, hey, you could send fake money back and forth, and yeah, that's great, but is it ever going to break out? Are there other use cases for it? But once I realized, hey, this is a powerful technology, there's other use cases for it. And for the people at home listening right now or watching this, the one of the major things that Bitcoin was able to do is solve what was known as a double spend problem. So that is the notion that let's say I've got $100 of Bitcoin and I want to pay you $100, but then I also want to pay someone else $100. So if I only have $100 and I try to say pay both of you at the same time $100, well, how does the technology know that I only have $100 to send to you, not to you and to one of your friends? And so Bitcoin, without getting into all the math, was able to solve that double spend problem in a decentralized fashion. And so there's no central authority that payment has to go through. So it doesn't go through Bank of America. It doesn't go through another centralized control that can stop you. And so to me, that's incredibly valuable, because I see as things get crazier and crazier, and as the money printing gets even more insane. Actually, I saw a PDF today from the it was a Financial Stability Board, where they're talking about how they could actually execute a bail-in, which a bail-in means basically that for some of these bonds, that they would like basically steal the value of your bond to help make them solvent. That's a kind of a quick, I don't want to get down that rabbit hole, but I saw that today. And there's an article, it was a whole like PDF manual execution from yesterday that was released. So this isn't like ancient history. Like, this is stuff that they put on their website yesterday in order to do. And so for me, it's sort of like a chaos. Bitcoin is sort of like a chaos hedge. It's sort of a central bank, messing everything up hedge. And I don't think it's necessarily in the short run an inflation hedge, but over the long run, the Fed messing things up and other central banks, will then sort of lead that to be a long-term inflation hedge. But and right now, I mean, people talk about dollar collapsing. Well, the dollar has already collapsed relative to Bitcoin. Already has collapsed relative to Ethereum and several other cryptos. But there are some, kind of getting back to Ethereum, there are some other Ethereum competitors out there, because right now Ethereum does have a scaling problem, and they are talking about this Ethereum 2.0 and how they're going to go from like a proof of work model, which is using electricity and having computers mining to solve these problems, versus going to a less electricity based system, where you owning the Ethereum will then basically help putting your Ethereum at stake to then validate the network. And there are others in that space. And so Ethereum, it does have like the first mover advantage on there, but it's sort of my opinion that if they don't eventually get their act together, that you could see these other type, like Cardano is a, and I'm not promoting any one of the, I mean, people should just do their own research on this. I'm just listing other coins that, are sort of competitors.
But before we jump, it's okay if I interrupt for a minute. Before we jump into the other coins, is it okay if I take a stab at just kind of describing how I understand Bitcoin to work and have you critique it and tell me where I'm wrong? And then we can talk about maybe differences between that and Ethereum and Cardano and some of these other coins that are coming out. So you mentioned this concept of this big, powerful computer network. And Bitcoin, as I understand it, operates on this proof of work concept, where there's this big network of computers. So think about this big, if you're thinking about it graphically or trying to put an image in your head, there's this big circle of computers around the world. And there are only so many Bitcoins that exist. And so if someone who owns Bitcoin is going to transfer it, like if I'm going to pay you for something using Bitcoin, what we do is we submit that transaction into the computer network in this publicized ledger. And how often is the mining process? Is that like every 10 minutes?
10 minutes. Yep. Nailed it.
So every 10 minutes, there is this big complex computer algorithm that the network of computers is tasked with solving. And what they're doing is verifying all the Bitcoin transactions that people are sending from place to place. And so what that does is allows Tim and I to send Bitcoin back and forth to one another without any other financial intermediary, which means that it's decentralized. And there's an incentive for that participants in that computer network to verify the transactions in a public way. Because every 10 minutes, as these mining transactions occur, the first computer or group of computers to solve that complex algorithm and verify the transaction is awarded new Bitcoins. So it's this self-balancing system where coins are traded around in a far more efficient way than our current banking system. If I wanted to PayPal you or Venmo you or something like that, we'd both have to have accounts on PayPal or Venmo. We'd have to link them to our bank accounts. Our banks would have to get involved and approve the transactions. And if either one of our banks, went under in the middle of the transaction, yes, there's government FDIC insurance on the first $250,000 of our accounts, but the records could be lost. There's not really a risk of that in the Bitcoin network because there's this vast computer network around the world. So there are a whole lot of use cases here because it's a far more effective and efficient way to transfer assets back and forth, be it coins or really anything else, because that concept can be extended. Is that a fair description? Where did I go wrong there?
No, I think you absolutely nailed it. I mean, a couple of things I would just add to that is you'd mentioned every 10 minutes. So every 2 weeks, they reset. And so let's say you've got, I mean, pretty much the trajectory is you've got, I mean, aside from May when China banned Bitcoin for like the 12th time, but this time was a more serious ban than other times. But what happens every 2 weeks, the difficulty algorithm resets. And so let's say now it's taking, I'm just making up a number. Let's say now it takes 8 minutes to find another Bitcoin or to, basically win the next transaction or validate the next block. Well, then since 8 minutes is quicker than 10 minutes, then, it will be exponentially harder the next go around. So every 2 weeks that does reset, but it can work the other way too. So if it starts taking 12, 14 minutes to validate a transaction, then 2 weeks when that gets reset. So it goes out to the 256 power. And so every single time every 2 weeks, it can like reset, either more difficult or less difficult depending on. And so, if someone were to try to attack the network, they'd have to supply additional resources, but those additional resources would then make it exponentially harder to try to win. And right now if you do validate the block, you are getting 6.25 Bitcoin plus all the transaction fees every 10 minutes. And so there's, multi-million-dollar daily, in the tens of millions of dollars subsidy for this network, for the miners to secure it. And because of game theory, everyone is basically incentivized to be a good actor and to not be a jerk on here. And so if you try to go in here to basically mess things up, you'll probably just waste a bunch of money, and the game theory is actually behind you to be a good actor and to contribute to the network. And you'd mentioned the thousands of computers. Now there's miners and there's nodes. And so a lot of nodes are miners, but nodes are basically keeping track of the public blockchain. And so even if, all the power goes out in America or somewhere else, I mean, there's these nodes all around the world, there's like over 10,000 of them. I've got one. There's nodes that are up in space now. And all it really takes is one of these to get back online to repopulate and reseed the entire network. Another sort of criticism people have is the electricity involved in here, but I would say that the biggest thing that's going to impact your bottom line as a as a miner is going to be the cost of electricity. So they are incentivized to basically push the envelope to do sort of like groundbreaking. A lot of like I know people that were mining using geothermic heat in Iceland from volcanoes to mine Bitcoin. There's people are like pushing the envelope, and you're also incentivized to find where electricity is being wasted or where it is the cheapest. And so a lot of it is being done through renewables. And then you also have to understand like what's the cost of the current legacy system. So all the bankers that all around the world that have to go, well, maybe not they're driving into the office anymore, but all the lights going on to all the buildings, and all the gas being wasted going out, and all electricity generated, and all the BS that's involved. And let's say you accidentally pay the IRS too much money, and then trying to get your refund back, or trying to it could take forever, whereas in the blockchain it can be done relatively instantly, 10 minutes or less. And so it is and a lot of the accountants can be basically replaced. So a lot of like the bean counters and people who basically it is a super advanced accounting system is basically sort of what Bitcoin is. And I say that with most of my family being accountants. So I'm not like nothing against the accountants, but there are a lot of industries that are going to be shaken up by this. And I was giving presentations 4 years ago talking about how I thought that the stock market would eventually be trading on a blockchain, and the benefits of that. And let's say like with bond payments, if a bond that pays once a year is going to have less of a premium on it than the bond that trades every month, versus a bond that trades every day, pays interest out every day, versus every hour, versus every minute, versus every second, versus every nanosecond. And so through the blockchain, you actually could devise systems where if there's a public record of somebody owning, this amount of bonds, it could be done through the blockchain, where that could pay out, theoretically every nanosecond, and it's just done automatically. And so there aren't people having to go and like print out checks or go deal with the legacy ACH type system or wire system, or however, or mailing things out. So there are a lot of different, and just think about like something like land titling. How much it costs to go, when you buy a home, to get, the title and make sure that that's all good. In the future, that's probably like the lowest hanging fruit there. So if you're working in the title agency, maybe try to get in while the getting's good now, but look for a backup, because I don't think that industry is going to necessarily be as profitable 10, 15 years from now in the future, because it could just be done through the blockchain.
And what I think you're describing is a lot of these Ethereum backed smart contract ideas, right? And so the title company exists to handle escrow, and if both parties do X, Y, and Z, then this contract will close, and the house or the land will change hands. You don't need the intermediary when you use a smart contract, right? It's all programmable in a very clear way, and if you verify the program at the beginning, you just don't have to go out of pocket to pay the intermediary. Is that accurate? Did I describe that okay?
Yeah, and if you had your land that was titled on the blockchain, now obviously you need good information in to create this, and it'll be sort of a pain to create this to begin with. But you could then verify that yes, this person does own this land, and he is selling it to me in good faith, and it could help verify that part of the title process as well. And that's only just one industry, and there's many different industries. Not to say that everything is going to be replaced by the blockchain, but you should be skeptical too, because the governments are going to use this as well. And most people don't realize that the first CARES Act, like in May of 2020, when everyone got the $1,200 checks, the initial bill was actually to send that via like a digital dollar through the Federal Reserve, was in the first text of the Maxine Waters bill. And so that was sort of sent up as a trial balloon. But the central banks right now are looking into what's called a CBDC, central bank digital currency. And this might sound crazy, but anyone can just go search that phrase CBDC, and then type in any central bank around the world, and you'll see right now about 90% of the countries representing 90% of the world's GDP right now are actively looking at implementing one of these. They're either in the implementation phase of it, like in China, or they're in the research phase, or they're in like the trial balloon phase of this right now. And so this is something that is coming. And at that point, that the governments could actually like cut people off if they didn't like what they were saying. And actually, there is a bank that sits above the Fed called the Bank of International Settlements, and the head of that, Augustus Carstens, a couple months ago, actually, on video, said that they want to have the ability to stop transactions and get between people and cut people off. And I know it sounds crazy and fantastical, but it is. I can show you the videos of this stuff, and it's
We
something
had
that I was.
so sorry to interrupt you, but we had a couple weeks ago a guest on the podcast who's a professor from the University of Missouri and talked about centralized digital currencies and what China is doing and how that allows them to use their social credit score when deciding who gets what, rather than sending cash around, which they have far less control over.
Oh yeah.
And that gets pretty scary pretty fast.
Yeah, and it was the big American tech companies that have basically set up what's going on in China. And the goal has always been to get a social credit score going on here in America. And so they've had to, so they're in my opinion, this is my opinion, not Grant's, they're going to take the, vaccine passports and probably turn that into a social credit score. And maybe they don't give you universal basic income, or they don't give you $1,000 a month in the future, or $2,000 a month in the future. And so they're going to use the blockchain technology to basically get socially engineer people to do what they want them to do. But going back, probably at least like 4 or 5 years in China, like if you dissented against the government or you didn't smile when their dictator was on TV, they would, drop. I mean, there's millions of people today that can't go on a plane, train, leave the country, send their kids to private school. I mean, all go to the movies. And this is before COVID, because their social credit was too low. And then if you talk to somebody who has a low social credit, then your credit will be lowered. And so like there's guys on like Chinese dating apps where they're like posting their social credit score, like, hey baby, look at me, I've got this big social credit score. And so that's like one of the things that they're bragging about on there. And so I mean, to me, Bitcoin is a hedge against all that, because that is where things are going. And I was doing videos on some of those subjects like 4 years ago, and now they've sort of have accelerated their push to do that. And they're not going to come out and call it social credit score. They're going to call it something else, and it's going to be for your health and safety. And so I've been very, very leery of everything that's going on. But the thing is, blockchain, I just want to paint the point that it can be the most freeing thing to humanity or the most enslaving. It just sort of depends who's on what side of it, and how it's utilized and implemented. So I mean, it should be something that people should be skeptical of. They should do their own research. But I'm sure people are wondering, have all sorts of questions about what if the government makes it illegal, and what if it gets hacked, or what if because there's always you can what if yourself to death and all this stuff too. But the thing is, a lot of criticisms people have about Bitcoin and not understanding about how Bitcoin works, they also don't understand how like reverse repos and all sorts of other stuff in the traditional system works as well. So, I mean, if people understood how the current system worked, and I think Henry Ford had a quote, and this is before the Fed was even created. I think Ford had a quote that said something like, if Americans understood the banking system, there'd be a revolution before the morning, or something of that. But the Fed is not the first central bank we've had. There was one in 1812 that ended, and then that's why the British came here and burned on the White House. There's another one that ended with Andrew Jackson, and he was attempted to be assassinated twice, and then both guns misfired. And Lincoln, they tried to implement one during his period as well. And he said, I've got an army in front of me that's the South, and I have an army of European bankers at my rear, and I far more fear the army at my rear. And so, I mean, this has always been a thing throughout history of them trying to get central banking to have control, because, it's not necessarily about the money, it's about the control. And if you're the one that's printing the money and the control of the money, you in essence have control of the world. And so, it's very, I gotta give him credit, because it's it's pretty much the most evil genius stuff that's ever been thought up of and implemented. And so I do have to give him a lot of credit for that. But I sort of figured this out early on, what they were doing, and to me, I would just rather, I trust the free market. And yeah, there's a lot of volatility, and obviously you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and obviously you don't want to mortgage your entire future on Bitcoin, and you should definitely do your own research on this. But you should also research how the current system works as well, because I think if people did understand how the current system worked or didn't work, then they would have a lot less faith in the traditional institutions that they have put their faith and money into.
Yeah, there are a lot of important nuances under the surface that I think the general population probably doesn't fully understand or appreciate. I tend to be an advocate for a boring old globally diversified portfolio. If you're putting all your assets in U.S. stocks and bonds, you're a little bit more concentrated in some of these risks we're talking about. Yes, you're not totally insulated from that if you're holding 20 to 40% of your equities in non-US stuff, but it helps a lot. That's one thing I've talked a little bit about on the podcast in the past. Another thing that I wanted to get your take on was, so as a casual, maybe a little more than casual observer myself, because I talk to people about this quite a bit, you have some countries like China attempting to ban Bitcoin transactions, mining altogether. And you mentioned they've done this several times. The last ban was a little more forceful than anything they've done in the past. And then on the other hand, you have countries like El Salvador who are fully endorsing it, accepting Bitcoin as legal tender, allowing people to pay their taxes in Bitcoin, giving them Bitcoin for setting up the government's digital wallet. And then here in the US, we're kind of somewhere in the middle where we're starting to regulate it a little bit more. We're starting to enforce taxation on gains of these assets a little bit more than we used to. Where do you think it goes from here? From El Salvador's standpoint, it seems like an opportunity to gain power, but if I'm a citizen of El Salvador, that is just incredibly risky to put it on the company's or our country's balance sheet. So you have these third world countries that are taking a risk going after it. You have other countries that have a far more substantial portion of the world's GDP outright banning it. What are your thoughts on some of these trends?
Well, I mean, most of these third world countries have, for lack of a scientific word, very crappy currencies in and of themselves that tend to implode in on themselves, quite frequently. And so
But they're all pegged to the US dollar.
I mean, but
The
some
one
of them do have their own. I mean, it sort of depends where, if they have debt that's, denominated in dollars, but they could have their own currency, but then their debt is denominated in dollars. And so then as the dollar gets stronger relative to their crappy currencies, then all of a sudden it takes, more and more of their crappy currencies to pay back their debt. And they basically never get out of their own debt. And so, and you also have to understand that most of the world can't even prove that they exist. So, I mean, you've got, this thing about most people over in Africa. I mean, you've got half of the world has never even been on the internet before. And so, and those people also, there's not going to be a Wells Fargo down the street because they can't even verify who they are to begin with. And so I think a lot of those types of people out there are going to bypass the legacy system eventually, because eventually most people in the world are going to be getting online, and you're going to, whether it's Elon Musk Starlink or someone else, I mean, you're going to be reaching, the far corners of the globe with this, relatively soon, would be my guess. And I guess, where Bitcoin goes from here is I believe it is the best version of money. And so, there's different definitions mean things. So there's money and there's currency, and technically what the US has is more currency than actual money. And that's a whole different nuance. But I do believe, that the long-term trajectory of the dollar is, that, the Fed's on a reckless path. There's no way, we can print ourselves out of this, hole that we're in right now. There's nothing they can really do to stop this inflation that wouldn't basically tank everything. And I do believe that in the future that their reckless policy is going to lead to the dollar crashing even more relative to Bitcoin. And it's going to be, a wild ride. And, if you can't, basically the more you see headlines that say Bitcoin's dead, or, why Bitcoin's going to zero or something. I mean, pretty much with any financial asset, this is sort of the trend, but you want to buy when others are fearful and be fearful when others are buying, the famous, Warren Buffett quote. And so, anytime that, the media is talking about Bitcoin's dead, that's the best time to get in, usually. And anytime that there's this huge euphoria and your grandma's asking you about Bitcoin, then that's usually the time, that is not a great time to buy, relatively speaking. But I do think it's going to be into the hundreds of thousands of dollars and eventually into the millions of dollars, for a Bitcoin, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but just, most people that have gotten into Bitcoin have gotten into it in the past year. And so they haven't, I think about 50% of the people who were recently surveyed had just gotten into Bitcoin. And so every single time there's going to be people who get into it, they're going to, not necessarily understand the volatility or be able to handle it. And then, Bitcoin's going to crash and they're going to go and sell their Bitcoin and then eventually buy back in at higher prices. But you're getting, stronger and stronger and stronger foundations every single time to build up the next rally upon. And, I think where it goes from here is, I think you see other countries start having favorable looks at this. You're going to have other countries that are more authoritarian. They're going to try to clamp down, like India and China. But, it's not the first time China's done something really stupid. I think in the, don't quote me on the exact timing of this, but I think in the 1400s, there was some decree where they were worried that, some of their Navy ships and some of their, private, naval vessels were getting, too big for their britches. And they basically ordered their entire naval fleet destroyed in like I think it was like 1400s, maybe 1500s. I wasn't planning on talking about this. I don't know the exact timing, but the point is they destroyed their entire naval fleet. It was, to try to clamp down, to try to get more control. But then they ceded that power all around the world, as we mentioned the other places like Portugal and Spain, and the UK, we're getting big naval fleets that then imperialize the rest of the world. And so it's not the first time China's done something stupid, or not the first time a government's done something stupid. It won't be the last. And so, where it goes from here is you're going to have these stable coins that are backed by dollars are probably going to have to be regulated through the traditional banking system. And then, you're going to have, like the JP Morgans, the Bank of America is issuing their stable coins, would be my guess. I'm just, theorizing on this. And, that's going to create some, turmoil. But I think the powers that be sort of wanted Bitcoin to be, that have like that, cool, sexy appeal to it. So then that way they can issue their own central bank backed currencies. And so you're going to see, some people that are going to clamor for, the government version of this. And then you're going to see people like me who are going to advocate towards the, the decentralized version of this. But I think that, either way, whether you like it or not, all the currency is going by way of being digital. It basically already is anyways. And so it's a trend that you're not going to be able to stop. And eventually you're going to have two choices. You're going to have the government version of it, or you're going to have the private free market version of it in places that allow it. And those are going to be the two decisions. And if it was for me, and if I could keep my money in one thing where the government can't take it, or I can have it in one thing where they could potentially take it, I'd rather go with the other one. And, it has past performance in case of future returns, but, it has done, remarkably well versus the dollar, the past 10 years since it's been created. But, it is very, very volatile. And so you should know that, at any point, it could collapse 50, 60, 70, 80%. Most of the cryptocurrencies out there are crap. I mean, so you've got most of the market that's out there of like 14,000 whatever coins. Most of them aren't really serving any useful purpose. There's people that are making stuff just to make money, and you've got to understand like the quality of the people who are in the asset. So people that are buying Bitcoin are buying it to, hold it forever in many cases, and people that are buying, Elon Dogecoin, are doing it so that way they can, make a quick buck, flip it, and dump it. And so, if the people who are holding onto your coin are in it because they think it's a pump and dump, well, someone's gonna be left holding the bag. Whereas if you're in something like Bitcoin and the people that are in it, are using it for long-term wealth preservation and, creating different types of legacies for their families and institutions, then that's something I feel much more strongly about in the long term. And then something like Ethereum, I think that is, a groundbreaking, development as well. It's just that there are other types of competitors that could potentially do better than Ethereum in the future if they don't solve their scaling problems. But the thing is, people actually have to use these, because it's one thing to own it, it's another thing to use it. And so there's a lot of people that have owned Bitcoin without actually sending Bitcoin anywhere. People have owned Ethereum without ever having sent Ethereum anywhere. But if the governments do try to clamp down on this more, and let's say they do ban it, then you're going to have a decentralized exchange infrastructure that's going to, it already is huge. I mean, so I don't want to discount this. Like you can already go onto these decentralized exchanges like Uniswap, and basically without any sort of like Coinbase type infrastructure in between you could go and buy and sell and trade on there right now. And there's other ones like, Sushi Swap, and I'm not making recommendations, talking about ones that are actually out there right now. And so if they do ban it, you're going to see, the sort of the underground, system explode even higher. And they've banned lots of things in the past. I mean, they banned alcohol and the price of alcohol went up. They banned drugs and the price of drugs went up. So it will just create a more vibrant, decentralized system if they try to come in with too much of a heavy hand. Because there are, let's say, you've got some Ethereum, you could, lend it out to one of these networks, get paid interest, and then, that extra interest is basically that extra Ethereum that you not donated, but you lent out to the network, is used as liquidity for, transactions going back and forth. And so you're going to see more decentralized infrastructure develop. And so if the governments wanted to stop it, they should have did something back in like 2012, 2011, 2010, because now I think it's too big for them to effectively stop without, taking down the entire internet. But I know, and I'm not trying to sound doom and gloom, because actually I am very quite positive on, where this can go to help free humanity. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm some Debbie Downer, because I'm very, excited about the future, where this holds. And that's why, since I do think it does have a great price appreciation potential, I'd recommend that people can get exposure to actual Bitcoin within inside of like Roth IRAs, where those potential gains would be hypothetically then tax free. And I've had some people that, listened to me, 3.5, 4 years ago. And again, past performance in case future returns, but some people are up, like 1,000% in their Roth IRAs tax free, because they have, done some of these types of strategies. And now it is relatively easy for them to do this. Whereas, in the past, it was much, much more difficult for them to get exposure to this. There's like the trust version of buying Bitcoin that some people know about that I don't want to give any ticker symbols for regulatory reasons. But, but I think
I've
owning
talked about those. Don't
Okay.
go buy the ETFs that trade right now. It's my general, because you don't want to, you get crushed on the roll in the futures contract. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yep.
Where can you go today to open a traditional or Roth IRA and put cryptocurrency inside of it?
Well, I don't want to necessarily give out like any recommendations of where they can go, because then there's, SEC type, I made a recommendation, and if that, place gets hacked or something happens, I've got, all the liability and no real protection on that. But you can go to my website, I guess, the libertyadvisor.com, which is, that's sort of like my moniker, but the site that I'm with is Innovative Advisory Group. And so between those two sites, you can find different places to, help get exposure to these alternative investment classes. And then we do work with a company called GMB, where they effectively are able to custody the crypto for our clients, which is, rare being a financial advisor, that you can, be into that crypto space. But, ultimately you want to be able to do your own research on this. Don't just get into something because you heard some random guy like me on the internet, talking about this. You should do your own research. And unfortunately, I did too much research on this, because I should have just put all my money into it instead of researching it. But I could tell you what what a Merkle tree root was before I even got into this. And the thing is, there are a lot of people that are in it recently got in it because they heard they can make a lot of money off of it. And that is somewhat dangerous, because, easy come, easy go. And those people could, kind of, some of them could peter out. And then we see another, evolution during the next cycle. But, this is a long-term play. It's not a get rich quick scheme, but on a long enough, if you got a 3, 4, 5 year time horizon, and you can weather some volatility, I think that it's an incredible space to look. And one of the biggest Bitcoin opponents would be Peter Schiff. And I made a video compilation of him many years ago, where he's like, Bitcoin crashed down to 150. Oh, it crashed down to 300. It crashed down to 600. It crashed down to 1,000. It crashed down to 1,500. Crashed down to 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. So you get the point. It keeps crashing, but now the price is $40,000 higher than the first time. Or basically like $50,000 higher than the first time you talked about it crashing. And so yes, it does crash down, but it's got a long-term trajectory of going up. It is risky, like anything, and but to me, keeping all your cash in the bank is risky too. That's sort of going broke safely, and I think that the current inflation we have is sort of just the very beginning of it, and hold on and buckle up for the next 10 years. So
yeah, it's been very interesting to me that Peter Schiff, being a hardcore libertarian himself, is so against this. And I don't know much about his point of view or what his arguments against it are, but it strikes me as a little out of character.
I've interviewed him with him on a podcast before, and this is probably right around the time Bitcoin was probably like 4,000 and gold was probably like 1,500. I'm like, well, Peter, what if gold was, what if Bitcoin was 10x the price of gold for 10 years straight? And he's like, oh, well, price is irrelevant. I'm like, well, I'm sure it'd be relevant if gold was 10x the price of Bitcoin for 10 years straight. And I'm like, is there anything that would ever get you to change your opinion? And basically he's just willing to dig himself deeper. And the thing is, if you also understand like who his dad's a big like libertarian folk hero that actually died in prison, Irwin Schiff. And so I mean his son is actually a big proponent of Bitcoin, and he had talked about like cutting his son out of the will. So Spencer Schiff, his son, I think he's like in his 20s, like he's like a big huge fan of Bitcoin. So that's kind of funny seeing that dynamic going back and forth. But yeah, it seems like he has just dug himself too deep of a hole, and he doesn't want to admit that he was wrong on something. And I mean, I got into this, talking about the Federal Reserve, thinking that I knew what I was talking about and had to admit that I was wrong. And so, eventually, maybe that will be the ultimate top indicator, is when Peter Schiff buys into crypto. Maybe that will be the moment you want to sell your Bitcoin at that point. But I've never sold Bitcoin. I've just, keep accumulating. But yeah, when Peter Schiff gets bullish on Bitcoin, maybe that's the time to question yourself. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, Tim. This has been very insightful. I don't know that my personal views are quite as extreme as yours are, but I really appreciate you spending the time and sharing some of your wisdom and what you've done, how you got into this, what your thoughts on it are now, because this is a rapidly evolving space and it's vast too. I mean, if I've taken away anything, it's that I've got a lot more reading to do to bone up on the finer parts of really what's going on in the whole ecosystem, so that I can better direct people we're working with in my firm. Where can you mentioned your website? Where can people watch some of your other stuff, follow you for those who are interested?
Yeah, so if you guys go to thelibertyadvisor.com, in the upper right hand corner, there's a media tab, and then that's got a link to the Liberty Advisor show, where I've got all the different propaganda that I put out there, and all the different mainly finance, economics, obviously some like geopolitics on there as well, and crypto. And I will say, from a geopolitical perspective, I did on camera in February 2020 predict that Trump was going to lose, and they'd blame it on the voting system. And I also predicted that he would win in 2016, and they would blame it on the Russians, both on video. So, and then I'm on lots of the alternative platforms too, like Odyssey and Picciot, and Apple, and different places that for the audio podcast. But yeah, not the typical financial advisor stuff you'd mainly hear everywhere else. But it's been great being on your show, and appreciate you having me on. And I'd be open to be on again if you wanted to get into any other finer points that we talked about.
Right on. Well, we'll have you back in the future once I figure out what questions to ask you.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.